On ABCRN, this is Big Ideas. Historian Frank Bongiorno is speaking to historian Michelle Arrow, former Labor President of the New South Wales Upper House, Meredith Burgmann, and inaugural Director of the Global Institute of Women's Leadership, Michelle Ryan. From the Ernies now to Julia Gillard's infamous misogyny speech, why did it have such an impact at the time that it did? Michelle Arrow?
I mean, in some ways it's a perfect segue, right, into, that sort of thing. And then to sort of fast forward another, 20 years or whatever and realise that was still happening. And I think one of the reasons why the Gillard speech, while Julia's speech was so well received, I guess, not immediately. I think it was very interesting that the media's first reaction to it was that it was all a bit histrionic and she was making a big deal out of everything and she was a bit of a hypocrite. But I think it went on to be incredibly well received. I think there was something that women could really connect to. So I think we had all seen, and I was doing this from a distance, so I was living in the UK at the time, but, we had all seen the way that she had been treated by the media, by the opposition, on a day-to-day basis. I mean, it was horrific, the sorts of things that were happening. The Ditch the Witch, the Liberal Party conference dinner where there was the Julia Gillard, thing on the menu. I won't even dignify it by describing it. But, it was horrific. And I think we saw her just in some ways downplay that. So I think we all knew she was aware of it, but she just sort of swept it aside, just kept going on. But that speech was a time where she just went, I just can't keep quiet anymore. And I think it was something we could all relate to, the idea of just keeping quiet, ignoring, ridiculous sexism, and then just getting to a point where you just can't take it anymore. And I think there was something that was quite spontaneous about that speech. I think the fact that it was given in that sort of situation, it was a discussion about the speaker. It wasn't, set up as a big discussion about sexism or about those sorts of things. So I think it was not predictable. No one was expecting it. I've talked to some of her staffers that worked for her at the time, and they had no idea at the time. This was not a pre-written speech. This was not something that was like, okay, is this going to play well? There was no polling done or anything beforehand. She was literally there in the House hearing Tony Abbott accuse her of sexism, and then she just snapped in some ways and just had enough. And so I think that spontaneity, the heartfeltness, and just the way in which it spoke to all of us about saying, imagine how it would feel to actually be able to say to someone, that's not okay. You can't speak to me like that. You cannot lecture me that way. And I think when you speak to her about this, so I've got the great pleasure of working with Julia at the Global Institute for Women's Leadership, and she said it was like she had been sort of biding her tongue for the last 2 years, and then all of a sudden she was just like, all right, that's it, I'm not biting my tongue anymore. And I think there was something that every single woman could relate to there. And for me, I woke up in the UK, so it had happened overnight for us, and woke up in the morning and suddenly, it's just everywhere. It was all over the news, all over the media, and just watching it was quite incredible.
Can I ask, Michelle and Meredith, how did you feel at the time about the speech?
Look, I remember one of the things I think when Julia Gillard became Prime Minister was that and I may be remembering this incorrectly, but my sense when she became Prime Minister is she didn't really play up her identity as a feminist. She sort of was like, yes, I'm acknowledging that I'm the first, but it wasn't really kind of I'm a proud feminist and sort of foregrounding that part of her identity. And I guess that part of my recollection of the speech itself was that she was really kind of responding to the political environment as a feminist in a way that she possibly hadn't really done before. And I feel like that's what made it really electric too, that it was not just I've had enough, but I'm letting this kind of aspect of my identity, I'm letting my interpretive lens of feminism kind of really dominate the way I'm responding in this particular moment. So that was sort of my sense of it.
Yeah, and she says that actually when you speak to her about it. She says, I actually regret that I didn't let that side of me out earlier. And part of it had been advice that she had been given, so she was advised to really downplay it. And part of it was just that sort of stoic, stiff upper lip kind of approach of saying, look, I'm not going to dignify all of that with a response. But I think she does say she really regrets not letting loose sooner. So
it was kind of a moment where feminism was a bit there wasn't necessarily... It's a different environment today. I think if the first female Prime Minister had emerged today, I don't think there would be any doubt that she would stand up in a press conference and proudly talk about being a feminist. A Labor Prime Minister, perhaps, maybe not a Liberal one. But, because they're not feminists, But it is interesting, I think, to sort of think about, if she had done that earlier, it might have changed the way that her leadership was interpreted too, I don't know, because it would have given her a more solid sense of her own identity. I did get the sense there was a bit of, we'll try knitting on the front of the Women's Weekly and we'll try all these other things to see what's going to work, in terms of presenting her as a female leader.
Yeah, but it's such a tightrope in some ways, exactly. Right? So, I mean, we see this with all our politicians. Hillary Clinton's run for the presidency was a really interesting one. And in psychology, we talk about this tightrope between being sort of feminist enough or not feminist enough, or warm enough and not warm enough. And the line is so tiny about where you can get it right. Because if you talk about feminism, then you're playing the woman card. And then all of a sudden you're not representative of all Australians. But then if you don't, then it's just like, well, then you're a bad woman and where's the sisterhood? So I do think it's such a fine line. So I think in some ways she was just trying to avoid it altogether. Probably, not successful, but it's difficult to know whether doing something different would have just catapulted her somewhere differently. She just would have got different criticism, I think.
And when you talk about the fine line, I mean, Barack Obama had exactly the same problem, which he was often criticised for not talking about race enough and then criticised about talking about it too much. So it's a very thin line. I must say that my own response to the speech was a bit the same as a lot of other people, in that I didn't sort of really think about it much, because we'd seen so much misogyny, not just directed towards Julia Gillard, but in that 3 or 4 years surrounding her prime ministership, misogyny just went up like that, because we noticed this when you're getting nominations for the Ernies. What was said about her was terrible, like deliberately barren. And, not just the
fruit bowl. Remember the fruit bowl?
It was all such... But it wasn't just about Julia. Suddenly it was like men had been given the permission to be awful about all women. And they were a dreadful 2 or 3 years of misogyny. So when I first heard the speech, I thought, I wish she'd used these other quotes. There's lots better ones than she used. I'm told that she had a few in her folder just to use at some stage. But looking at the speech later, and I'll have to admit, at the time I'd fallen out with Julia over refugees, and I was glad we had a first woman Prime Minister and everything, but I was still a bit critical of her. But then seeing what she had to put up with was terrible. But looking back at the speech now, what hits me is the rhythm of it. It's got this fantastic rhythm. I will not be lectured by that man. And that's why it's become a famous speech, because it really was about defending a terrible misogynist speaker, which is what, of course, the Liberal Party concentrated on.
Yeah, I saw an interview with her speechwriter who did not write that speech. Yes. So she had basically put that together. And he was just like, in some ways it's so frustrating that the speech she's most known for, I had nothing to do with.
I think, too, there's something about the clarity of political communication that speech represented that was really powerful as well. I think we sort of really crave that as a public who is listening to a lot of politicians kind of dance around the main theme and they don't really answer the question. And then you hear someone speak so truthfully. And as Meredith said, there's a beautiful cadence to it that just had this, it went viral, globally. And I think there's something
but
powerful
not immediately.
About that too. Exactly.
It's become much more famous now than it was then. Yeah.
Yes.
We've got some questions coming in. I'll ask you this one. So how can the young women of Australia regain hope for a fair, just and safe world for them to live in? Who'd like to have a go at that? Michelle Ryan, would you like to? You're working very much
I'm happy to jump into sort of... Yeah. I mean, in some ways, if I twist that question around a little bit, I actually think it's the young women that are giving me hope at the moment. So if I look at people like Grace Tame or Brittany Higgins or Chanel Contos and things like that, I think that's, for me, where a lot of the hope comes from. I think there's an anger, there's a purpose, and there's a self-efficacy, as we were talking about before, that things can change. So things like the March for Justice, and I'm not saying that was just young women. I mean, I think there were women of all generations involved in that. But I think that's where a lot of my hope comes from. So I do think that it is that banding together, and I think it is just not tolerating it, not biting your tongue for that long and speaking out. So and I think doing that collectively is so important as well.
Young women just have so much confidence today. I'm overwhelmed by them because I battled through my teens and into my 20s just trying to get through the next day because I didn't actually know what I was doing. I wish I knew then what I know now, but had the energy I had then. And today's young things just seem so knowledgeable and confident, and I have absolute faith that the future's going to be better with them, both young men and young women, actually.
Oh, look, I think one of the things that's interesting, having done a lot of, being a historian of these movements, is one of the things that I think that young women did in the 1960s and 70s was they kind of saw that things were wrong and they did something about it, and that's harder to do today. And I think often we get into a sort of generation of, well, you guys just need to be more active and you need to do things. But I think that, we do have to think about what can we do to make that better future. So it is about, kind of doing the sorts of things that Meredith did. Like that sort of stuff takes courage and it takes time, but it is, we do need to be prepared to put our money where our mouth is and kind of work to be part of those movements, to do things like being part of the March for Justice, but also to kind of take that next step and see what we can do. So I think, and that will give confidence and that will build that sense of possibility. As Michelle pointed out, that sort of sense of self-efficacy, part of that is achieving victories can then help you kind of push that on. So I think that thinking about your own potential for action is good too.
And of course a lot of younger women are very involved in climate action or climate protest too, and picking up, I guess, a lot of the traditions, Meredith, of, you and anti-apartheid, those sorts of techniques and so on. I have another question here. What damage was done do you think, to the future of young women aspiring for political leadership by the way that Julia Gillard was treated by mainstream media and others?
Yeah, I don't think it was just Julia Gillard, right? I talked about Susan Ryan before, and she copped a lot of flack as well, right? She was called a feminist dictator in the media. Fred Nile organised whole rallies against her and things like that. So in some ways, but it is stark. I think Julia's is stark in that it's sort of just like, oh, come on, this was in the 2000s. So, the research does show that these things do cause problems, and it's interesting to note that we haven't had a second female Prime Minister, right? And I think that is part of the problem. When you hear Jacinda Ardern talk about her Prime Ministership, for example, she always says, look, I was the third female Prime Minister in New Zealand, so actually I didn't even have to address or think about most of the time being a woman. And I think in some ways Julia did, absolutely. And everyone else does as well. They think of her as a female Prime Minister. They think about what she was up against. And so I do think a lot of young women think about what they want to do with their activism, and they don't want to go into politics. They want to look at changing the world in other ways. And I think that's a real shame. Julia always, when she talks, she wants to get this balance right between talking about how awful it was but not wanting to put off other women. And she does talk about the saying it was awful, but actually I managed to get so much done. I'm really proud of what I did. So I hope that actually, that women can feel the confidence that maybe things are a bit better now, that Julia's paved the way in some ways, but also hopefully the media and the public are not going to step back and let that happen again, that the media will step forward, won't just, repeat, coalition talking points, for example.
I think the woman who really suffered from being a woman was Hillary Clinton. Yeah. When you look at the attacks on her for everything, and the quote I love from Hillary is, "Don't you believe it, the hair matters." Yeah. Because she got such incredible attacks for wearing a scrunchie one day. And there were lots of problems with Hillary's political outlook, but the way they piled on her was just terrible. I think it'll still be the same if we've had women premiers and they've had to put up with it. Look at the attacks on Palaszczuk for changing the colour of her hair. Suddenly it's a big deal. So I think women are still going to have to put up with it.
Michelle, did you want to...
Yeah, I think one of the things that strikes me is that being a politician looks like a really hard job if you're male or female. I just think the time that it takes, the kind of, it just looks like a really difficult job. And I think a lot of women possibly don't want to take up that role for that reason. But I also think too, one of the things that is encouraging slightly, I think, is the stuff that's happened around Parliament House and the kind of, inquiries into the Parliament House as a workplace, because I think that you're not going to change the kind of culture of overwork and the sort of harassment culture without changing the conditions for the people that work within Parliament, because they're often the people that then go on to be politicians. So I think that there is some encouraging signs there around at least addressing some of those work and seeing, Parliament House staffers as workers and as people who deserve a safe workplace and those kinds of things. But, yeah, I think a lot of women might look at what goes on in politics and think there are other ways to live my life and do the things that are important, without... It is tricky, I think.
I have another question here. The women's movement in the 1970s happened before my time, but the image I have in my mind is one of white, educated, cisgendered and non-disabled women. Can you comment on how the ideas of intersectionality have developed since then and how much further we still have to go?
Well, one of the issues I was interested in, even academically, about the women's movement was why the First Nations women weren't at all interested in being part of it. And a lot of my friends were First Nations women. So I did a series of interviews with them in 1974, I think it was, and wrote a piece about black sisterhood, and they didn't want to be part of the white women's movement, mainly because we were fighting for things that they weren't interested in. We were fighting for equal pay, and the statistics showed that Aboriginal women were better paid than Aboriginal men. They were better educated than Aboriginal men. They were more likely to be head of the household, And we were fighting for abortion rights, and they were fighting for the right not to be forcibly sterilised. So I found that really interesting. And what shocks me now is that article from 1974 is still quoted today because no one's done an update of why Aboriginal women have a different attitude to feminist issues, or might have. Who knows? No one's done the work, which I think is really interesting. So I was already very aware that the women's movement was mainly university students, marching down Glebe Point Road. But we very soon came to recognise that middle-aged women and older women, and it soon became a much broader issue. And look, most liberation movements at the time started with the young. I mean, that's the point. It was young black men that were doing the sort of Black Panther stuff. And so I think the white women's movement was very inward-looking, really, but it was the start.
Yeah, I think that's right. A lot of Indigenous women were just simply saying, this is not really we're not really interested. Our interest is in, kind of defending Indigenous families, in supporting men.
And poverty. It was all about poverty, their stuff.
Land rights. That's not to say that there were a lot of, politically active Aboriginal women, and they were doing things like running, breakfast programs, or they were part of the land rights movement, and they were doing those kinds of things. That's not to say that Indigenous women were entirely absent. And I think one of the things, reading a lot of feminist periodicals from the 70s, is that they're discussing these issues. They're trying to kind of grapple with the sense of, well, how do we make sure that we recognise Indigenous women? And, of course, there was a lot to go on. They were dealing with a lot of stuff. They were kind of, as Meredith said, it was the start, and they were trying to theorise everything all at once and deal with everything all at once, and they didn't always deal with everything. But I think that, the kind of growing awareness as the movement itself, and as the movement becomes more, it moves into academia more, I think then the sort of discussion of those issues, particularly around things like disability, around, as you say, older women and the role of older women in the movement become much more a part of it. And I think certainly I feel like in the way that feminism is discussed and the kinds of faces that you see in the media today, I think there's obviously, sometimes we still tend to see too many white faces, but I do think there is an increasing diversification of and Twitter and social media, I think, has been really important with that, because it gives, women with disability a kind of a different public profile. There are sort of ways, more public spheres, I think, in which more public conversations can happen around feminism. But that said, if you look at the way that Lydia Thorpe is treated in the media, it's kind of like a rerun of Julia Gillard, in the sense that the sort of stuff that is said about her and the kind of hatred and kind of criticism that attaches itself to someone like Lydia Thorpe, I think we've still got a long way to, a lot to learn about the way we just talk about women in the public eye.
Yeah, and I would also say an intersectional approach is critical. And I would say it's not that we have to make our feminism more intersectional. I actually think that if we want to do anything, about gender equality, we have to recognise that the patriarchy, that white supremacy and that capitalism all just hold each other up, and they're all completely intertwined. You can't try and just deal with sexism without dealing with, and I would put heteronormativity and transphobia and all of those things together. These things are entirely intertwined. So you can't actually address one successfully without addressing the other. I think we need to do better, and we need to see them not as separate movements, but actually as intertwined movements, and work together to actually address inequalities in all the ways in which they take form.
So I did want to go to the panel with one last question, really, and that was, where are we today? We still have, obviously, a gender pay gap that you've all referred to, I think. We still have sexual harassment in the workplace, exposure of a culture of hostility to women in parliaments. Are you optimistic or pessimistic about the general direction of things at the moment, and what still needs to change?
I mean, for me, it's not an either-or question. I think I am optimistic in that I see all of these wonderful young women coming forwards, and they give me hope, as I said before. But I just think the important thing that we really need to recognise is that, change is not linear. It's not just this gradual increase that goes back. And I often see it as this pendulum that goes backwards and forwards. The reason we got so much backlash and sexism was not despite having a female Prime Minister, but because we had a female Prime Minister, it's the backlash against that. And I think what we need to do is also not just focus on going forwards, but anticipating that backlash and that resistance and that pushback against change, and dealing with that at the same time. So I think we're often thinking about where we want to be, but not how to bring other people with us. And I do think that I think just like American politics, I think here in Australia we're seeing it as well, as there's this real sort of diversification and extremism of views. It's quite bimodal now. If you look at young people, on average they're about as equally feminist as we were generations ago, but it's not indicative, because actually there are people that are very anti-feminist and then people that are very feminist. And I think understanding that, and that there are very different journeys for those groups of people, are really critical for us to move forwards.
I do think that young men of today are much better in general than the young men of my day, and I have huge hope for the young women. I think have been terrific, but it still worries me that it appears that we still have such high domestic and family violence issues, and that project that started in Sydney of counting the number of women that are killed each week. Until that gets addressed, there's no chance of equality. And I know that equal pay would help, and we're still, as I say, as far behind in that as we were in the 1970s. But it's the threat of violence that so many women live with that I think is the big issue.
Look, I think one of the things that was really interesting was watching the ways that the events of 2021 really, I think, changed the 2022 election. The intervention from Grace Tame and Brittany Higgins, and then the kind of movement that sparked, it really did change the election, I think, because, when they appeared at the press club early in 2022, that reignited that conversation. And I think when you saw the ways that the election was being kind of pitched, Labor was pitching itself to women in a very quiet way, but the kind of discussion around the care economy and the gender pay gap and the kinds of things that they've done in government, I think was really encouraging to me, that you could see that on the one hand, there was this kind of movement of women, and it wasn't a government that wasn't just necessarily interested in paying lip service to a kind of corporate feminism, or we're going to get lots of women on boards or whatever. It was really the sorts of important issues that we all know are fundamental to women's equality. The jury's still out, of course. We don't know yet what is going to happen with all of these things, and I think there is something a little bit cynical about the kind of push to increase job seeker only for people over 55. That's not necessarily going to improve the lives of younger women who happen to be on it. But I do think that there was something encouraging to me about the idea that there was a kind of, Brittany and Grace Tame and a whole bunch of young women lit a fire outside of Parliament, and it resonated right up until election day, I think. You can sort of see in the polling the way that women's vote just sort of cleaved away from the coalition at that point. So that to me was sort of encouraging. And I think, again, it's kind of thinking about young women and people who were prepared to get out on the street and say we're not going to tolerate this anymore. And that's really an important way to make change.
Michelle Arrow, Professor in Modern History at Macquarie University, rounding off that panel, not then, not now, not ever, on the waves of feminist activism that continue to change the face of Australian politics, don't they? With Meredith Burgmann, a former Labor President of the New South Wales Upper House, Michelle Ryan, the inaugural Director of the Global Institute of Women's Leadership at the ANU, and host, historian and author Frank Bongiorno. Big thanks to the Bendigo Writers' Festival and LaTrobe University who made that event happen. And I'm Natasha Mitchell.